Good morning. I'm Anuj Malhotra, Dean of the George Washington University School of Business, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this episode of George Talks Business, hosted in partnership with the GW Department of Athletics. And it is my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome our guest, David Rubenstein, co-founder and co-executive chairman of the Carlyle Group and the chairman of the board of the Economic Club. Welcome to the show, David.
My pleasure.
Thank you also all for submitting questions that I will try to incorporate in my questions and conversation today. So David, last time we sat together for a conversation in 2019, which was before the pandemic. You have, since then, of course, 2 years of pandemic, you have had a lot of experience talking to a lot of different folks. Tell us what you think on how well we have handled the pandemic globally, nationally, locally.
Well, in some respects, great. In some respects, terrible. The great aspect was that typically a vaccine takes 7 years to develop. The polio vaccine took about 7 years. Record time before that was maybe for Ebola, maybe 4 years. This vaccine was developed in less than a year. And that you could develop a vaccine that at least 60% of Americans have taken and a large percentage of other people in developed worlds have taken is incredible. Suppose there had been no vaccine, we'd have death tolls much higher than we have now. The bad part was we recognized in the United States that our healthcare supply chain is heavily dependent on foreign countries, and that we do have a large percentage of people in this country that do not believe in vaccines, don't believe in listening to government authorities about healthcare. So we've exposed some of the fissures of our society. The other challenge is that it's very apparent that the developed world takes care of itself a lot better than the developing world. And as of this date, I think the developed world has largely given up on trying to make sure that everybody in the developing world is vaccinated. That was initial effort, but now the world has moved past that. So on the one hand, we learned a lot. If there was another pandemic next year or later this year, we would be better prepared, but we wouldn't be perfectly prepared.
So David, in terms of the economic impact of the pandemic, the economy in the US is doing well. So is there something which is lagging, which do you think there'll be some kind of economic pressures in the world?
Well, you say it as well. Yes, the stock market did quite well. The private equity world didn't miss a beat. I mean, we raised more money, we invested more money, we exited more money. The stock market did well for anybody that's invested in the stock market. If you were somebody that didn't have a college degree or a graduate degree, you worked with your hands, you worked in a food truck, you have an hourly kind of job that is subject to being laid off from things slow down, you didn't do that well. And the result is that the, I would say, less advantaged people in our society fell further and further behind. So I think the income gap got worse, and I think the social mobility gap got worse in this country. So yes, the economy seemed to do well, but even for the wealthy people, they all have recognized that at some point you have to pay the price. And we did all this by injecting about $6 trillion into the economy, which meant we have another $6 trillion of debt. And as interest rates go up, it's going to be more expensive to pay that debt. And we also have fueled inflation. It's been fueled a bit by what's going on in Ukraine and Russia, but surely we will have inflation to live with for a while, and we'll have more debt to live with. So the economy survived, and the alternative was worse, but it wasn't perfect.
So you mentioned Ukraine. In fact, last week you were interviewing in the Economic Club the Polish ambassador, Polish ambassador to the U.S., and that was a fascinating conversation, by the way. Following that conversation, I talked with quite a few people, and there was some mixed things in terms of the opinions on companies which are divesting from Russia or who are staying in Russia. And could you tell, what are your views on whether the company should be divesting and whether there'll be permanent issues economically after that?
The issue really is not Russia so much, but China. If China were to invade Taiwan, would we really impose the same types of sanctions on China? Would we basically force American companies out of China? Because that would be significant to the global economy. China is the second biggest economy in the world, and you can say by purchase price parity, the biggest economy in the world. Russia is an insignificant economy in the global scheme of things. As some people would say, it's basically a petrol station with a nuclear arms. Basically, they don't make anything that anybody cares about other than gas and oil. So it's not a global economic power. So moving out of Russia, if you're a company, it's like taking the sleeves off your vest. It's not the end of the earth, unless you're maybe an oil company. So I would say it hasn't had a gigantic effect on American companies, and it has had an effect on Russia. Russia has been able to survive because they're still selling gas and oil. And when that ends, if it does end, then that war will end pretty quickly.
So, David, you have been, of course, as I said, talking to a lot of people, and and there have been so much disturbance in the last couple of years, not just the COVID, now the Ukraine, the insurrection, the Black Lives Matter movement, the killings of George Floyd and others, et cetera. In this world of polarization, if you were to look at it from and you have a very good knowledge of history as well, what would be an inspiring message from a president or a presidential candidate that will perhaps go a long way?
Well, I'm waiting for one. Be happy to listen to one. It's a sad situation now that the country is fairly bitterly divided. When I came to Washington to work on Capitol Hill and I worked in the White House for President Carter, Democrats and Republicans did talk together, and bipartisanship was thought to be a sign that you knew how to get things done. Today, bipartisanship is out the window, and if you're too friendly with the party of the opposite party, you probably aren't going to advance in your own party. The only way that's going to change is if money goes out of politics, because both sides are raising so much money from the extreme wings of their party that they feel they can't really come to the middle without being penalized. Why do they need to raise so much money? If you have a lot of money, you intimidate your opponents not to run against you. Also, you have more money, usually you win. And thirdly, you can keep the money after you leave office. You can keep it for essentially anything that's politically related. So people love raising money. And until money is not as important as it is in politics today, I think it's not going to change very much. Now, of course, if you have a national crisis, you have a 9/11 type of thing, people will pull together. And the Congress has pulled together on Russia-Ukraine, but that's a temporary thing. I don't think it's all of a sudden the era of good feelings is going to break out on Capitol Hill. I wish the president could have a message that would excite and unite people, but I don't know that there's anybody on the scene today that has such a brilliant message that all of a sudden people are going to say, you know what, I'm going to lay down my arms, and I'm going to fight for the center and do bipartisan things. I don't see that happening anytime soon.
So in context of this discussion right now, I would like to bring up one of your recent books, The American Experiment. Can you talk a little bit about what that experiment is and what do you see as the challenges in this American experiment?
Well, historically, governments basically were run by kings or autocrats or by a small group of people. And in this country, we came together in 1776 and then 1787 and so to basically create a country where people had a chance to vote and express their views on who should be running. Now, we have to be honest. Women didn't have the right to vote. Slaves didn't have the right to vote. Jews didn't have the right to vote. So basically, white Christian men had the right to vote. But I mean, that was a step forward. And it wasn't everybody, because you had to have property and so forth. But it was a concept and a structure which allowed us to say we are doing things different than we'd gotten from England or other European countries where royal families more or less ran things. I would say that it was a step forward and was an experiment. And Thomas Jefferson didn't think it would last more than 20 years. Benjamin Franklin famously said, it's a republic if you can keep it, implying to somebody who asked him about what kind of government we're going to have, that we might not be able to keep it. We've kept it, amazingly, for 250 years almost, even though many people didn't think it would last. So it's an experiment, and my book is about the effort to give Americans more of the rights and freedoms that are in our wonderful rhetoric. In the Declaration of Independence, we say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was great rhetoric. I wish I could have written something like that, but it didn't really mean anything because you had slavery and you didn't have women having the right to vote and so forth. But we've been trying to move forward to honor these kinds of rights that we talked about in our founding documents, including the Constitution. It's an experiment in trying to see whether a government with these type of rights promised to people can actually come into existence and actually make a good government for everybody that way.
So in your book, David, you talk about certain key genes, 13 key genes, if I remember correctly, that would bring the country together. And I especially remember entrepreneurship and capitalism as a couple of those keys. So tell us a little bit more about those genes and whether anybody in the audience or anybody in the students who are watching it can become an entrepreneur.
Everybody has, millions of genes in their body, and obviously we're familiar with the concept, and that's what makes each unique. We have the genes from our parents and so forth. What I was trying to use as a metaphor, in effect, was say that the country is a body politic, and it has its own genes, just like human bodies have genes. And our genes, we have thousands of them as well, but every country has certain genes that are endemic to the body politic of that country. So in this country, for example, I said the right to vote, the belief in democracy, the belief that there should be equality. Well, these are genes that we kind of have as part of our system. If you were to go to Mongolia and say, what are the genes there, they'd be different. Every country has different genes. And what I said among the 13 genes were a belief that capitalism is the best economic system, not perfect, but the best, and the belief that entrepreneurship is a way to move a country forward. And we've encouraged entrepreneurs throughout our country's history. And really the wealth of this country has been built by entrepreneurs building great companies, ultimately employing people and creating wealth for everybody. So that's why I think it's part of the genes. If you go to some countries, they would say, no, you're born in a certain class, you don't rise up from that class, and we don't want entrepreneurs building companies. And there's many countries like that, but our country is different.
So you yourself have been an entrepreneur. You founded the Carlyle Group. Tell us a little bit about, with your background of being a lawyer, and how did you end up finding the Carlyle Group, and what do you attribute your success to?
Well, first, I wasn't that good as a lawyer. I was trained as a lawyer. I wanted to work in the White House. That was my goal, politics and government. I had come from a blue-collar family with no education in my parents, and I just thought that politics was a good thing for me, and I was interested in it. In those days, there were no billionaires. There were no tech startups, private equity firms, hedge funds. If you were interested in making money, you might go into your family business if your family had one. Otherwise, you might go into a profession. If you were Jewish, going into a profession was easier than going up the totem pole of a big company. So being a lawyer or a doctor was not uncommon. I was just interested in not making money, but in politics and government. I did work in the White House for President Carter. Afterwards, I went back and practiced law, and I realized pretty quickly, and my clients did as well, that I wasn't that good a lawyer. And I wasn't going to get anywhere. And you have to really love what you're doing to get somewhere. Nobody won a Nobel Prize hating what they do. You have to love it. And I didn't love the practice of law, and it obviously didn't love me. So I took a chance, like entrepreneurs typically do. I read that an entrepreneur will typically start his or her first company, leaving Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates aside, from between the age of 28 and 37. That was the typical norm. And I was then 37. I said, okay, if I'm going to ever start something, I better do it now. And my practice of law is not going anywhere so great. So I did start a company, Carlyle, and I recruited some people who knew more about finance than I did, and then we built it into one of the larger private equity firms in the world.
So, you are here. A lot of students have asked me this question, to ask you this question. How do you decide where to invest, and what advice can you give us about investment?
Well, private equity firms historically were mom and pop operations. When Henry Kravis and George Roberts did the KKR deal, the RJR deal, and the KKR did the RJR deal in 1989, they only had about 6 or 7 investment professionals. They had a fair amount of money by those standards of those days. They did a $24 billion buyout with very few people. And the firms in those days just specialized. You were private equity or buyouts. You did venture capital or maybe growth capital. People didn't have everything under one office. I came up with the idea of having multiple different disciplines and then using the brand name of Carlyle and the back office of Carlyle to kind of grow this firm into a Fidelity, a private equity, or a T. Rowe Price of private equity, having many different funds of people to offer to people. It worked out reasonably well, but we made some mistakes, of course. Today, it's hard to say what's the best area to invest in. It depends on what your risk profile is. Depends on your appetite for putting money at risk in different areas, what you need for current income, what you need capital appreciation. It depends on what you're interested in. And in a new book I have coming out in September, it's called How to Invest. I've interviewed the greatest investors in the United States: Stan Druckenmiller, Jim Simon, Sam Zell, John Gray, Michael Moritz, and basically put together what I think the rules are for being a really great investor. But one of the important things is knowing what you really want out of your investment. If you're an individual of certain wealth, you might need something different than a individual with different type of wealth, or if you're younger, you're older. So it's different kinds of things. I'd say right now, generally, people who have money, a modest amount of money or relatively fair amount of money, probably should look for rates of return overall 6 to 8%. I would say real returns 6 to 8% would be great. Now, because real returns are going to be complicated because inflation is going up, it's hard to know whether you can actually get 6 to 8% real. But I think when you try to get rates of return that are double digit on a consistent basis on all your money, you're probably going to make some mistakes. You're going to take too big a risk. So you just need to know what you want to do and have good money managers helping and advising you and doing other things. It's not that easy to do.
So not cryptocurrency. You should not be investing in cryptocurrency.
I didn't say that.
So I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Cryptocurrency, people my age made fun of it because you say there's nothing underlying it. But on the other hand, here's what's happened. Cryptocurrency obviously has found a niche among people who don't believe the government's doing a good job of keeping their currency worth is what it's supposed to be. People who want to be able to not have other people know what they're doing with their money, their assets. People that like to hear about the stocks going up or cryptocurrency going up time, they like to take some gambles. So I've said up until recently, look, when you go to Las Vegas, you know you're going to lose money if you're reasonably intelligent. But you go there because there's fun. You just want to, you're fun in gambling. Some people get fun out of gambling. And if you do, go there and lose, some money, fine. I tell people, if crypto is maybe like the same thing. You know you're going to maybe lose money. It might be going down to zero. But if you enjoy trading it and telling people how smart you are by buying Ethereum or buying Bitcoin and so forth, fine. If you can afford to lose 1 or 2 or 3% of your net worth, fine. Same with gambling. Now I think it's changed. Because the Russian situation has shown people that no matter what assets you own, somebody can take them away. People who are wealthy increasingly, I think, are going to put their money into some type of cryptocurrencies so that they can theoretically have something that nobody can take away or nobody can know about, or at least readily take away. Obviously, you can have some people stealing it. But so I think you're going to see more and more wealthy people. So let's doing this. So let's suppose you're a Chinese wealthy entrepreneur and you're very wealthy. You might want to have some money outside of China, but you can't get it all out of China. You're not supposed to, as a Chinese citizen, buy cryptocurrencies. But suppose they have some money outside, they buy cryptocurrencies, and then all of a sudden their wealth is taken away by the Chinese government or somebody else. If you have crypto, they might say, well, nobody will know what I have, and I can get it eventually. So I think you're going to see an increase in it. I have not bought cryptocurrencies. I have invested for my family office in companies that service the crypto industry. I don't think it's going away. And also because Congress is not likely to regulate it. The people that love cryptocurrencies tend to be young people, libertarian, I would say more Republican, Democratic, but maybe that's wrong. But people who are going to basically lobby Congress and say, don't take away our right to invest in these kinds of things. And I think the pressure is going to be too great to regulate it heavily.
So you mentioned, David, that you have talked to a lot of investors and you're writing a book on that. There are a lot of our students who are in finance, who are wanting to become professional investors. What are some of the skills that they should be focused on?
Well, to be a great investor, I think what I found in my interviews is one, being reasonably intelligent helps. You don't have to be a genius, but reasonably intelligent. Having a facility for numbers probably helps. Paying attention to details helps. Being willing to make the final decision on things helps. Reading a lot. You can't know too much, and read as much as you can about a given area or other subjects that might be relevant. But also, the great investors have one other attribute, which is that they are willing to go against conventional wisdom. The easiest thing in the world to do is to take the path of least resistance or go along with conventional wisdom. Nobody will criticize you typically. The people that have made the greatest fortunes or greatest entrepreneurs, but certainly investors as well, are people that are saying, look, I'm going to do something nobody else wants to do. For example, when I interviewed one person for the book, he's a big investor in cryptocurrencies. When he started doing it, people made fun of him. And people were, saying what an idiot he is. Now he's got staggering, billions of dollars of Bitcoin, and now he has the last laugh. You have to be willing to go against conventional wisdom. That doesn't always mean you'll be right, but if you only go along with conventional wisdom, you're not likely to stand above the pack and become a great investor.
So one of the things, at least, we have been trying to tell our students is to really have a grasp of artificial intelligence and technology. How do you think that is going to change the investments?
In having a knowledge of intelligence,
yes,
technology. Well, I'm what I call a last adopter. I usually wait until the system is about obsolete, then I finally say, okay, I'll try it. So I had a BlackBerry until they wouldn't service it anymore, and they kind of went out of business. So I finally got this, and now that I'm really good at the iPhone, I think it'll go out of business soon because I actually know how to use it finally. But I think having younger people have a greater facility for technology, obviously, than people my age. So I think if you don't understand technology or how to really use a computer well and have the skill sets to get around the internet, you're likely to be almost the modern day equivalent of illiterate. We have a big illiteracy problem in our country, but we're going to have a bigger computer literacy problem if people don't really learn how to get around the internet or use the internet, the computer skills, or have the computer skills necessary to kind of communicate. That's how people are going to communicate in the future. One of the advantages our country has is we have pretty good access to the internet and pretty good facility with this for most people, not everybody. People in developing markets still don't have even access to the internet, let alone the facility to learn how to use it. So that means probably the developed markets are going to advance even more than they were against the developing markets if the developing markets don't really get more access to the internet.
So let's change subjects a little bit. And there have been a lot of questions from the audience on leadership. And of course, at GW, our students are really active, and they are involved in many student clubs and organizations, many of them seeking presidencies and offices. But in your book, How to Lead, you talk about dividing your life into 3 parts. And you said something about winning in the first third may not translate into becoming a leader or being impactful later on. So are all these students who are running for these presidencies and other offices of the clubs and organizations, that's not going to necessarily translate into leadership roles later on?
I was trying to rationalize my own life because I wasn't that great a leader early on. And nobody would have said to me, you're going to be a very prominent entrepreneur or successful, whatever, because I was, an average person, modestly intelligent, not a great athlete. Nobody thought I was that charming or gifted in any way. In fact, in my college class, I became the only person in my college class to become chairman of the board of the university at Duke University, and the only person in my law school class to become the chairman of the board of the University of Chicago. If you'd ask people at Duke or University of Chicago if I was in the class at the time, they wouldn't even remember that I was there. So I wasn't that big a presence. But my point was that people that are the Rhodes Scholars, the Supreme Court clerks, the student body presidents, very often they get there because they have certain skills that are useful in teenage years or early 20s, but then they coast on what the laurels they might have already gotten. So they say, I'm a Rhodes Scholar, I don't need to work hard the rest of my life. And there are people who say that being selected as a Rhodes Scholar is often the peak of your life, and after the age of 21, it goes down. So my point was to try to say to people who are superstars early on, if you just stay as a superstar early on and just just rely on that reputation, you don't work as hard in the second, third, or third third of your life, you'll probably fade. And very often it's a tortoise and hare situation. People like me come along, we work hard, we're not that great early on, and then later in life, because we worked hard, we got lucky, and then we kind of took a more dominant position. The people that have run the world, with very few exceptions, were not superstars early on. In fact, the presidents of the United States, of the last 25 I can think of, the only one who was a superstar as a young person was probably Bill Clinton. He was a Rhodes Scholar. But nobody thought Barack Obama, when he was in high school, was going to be anything that great. I think he would agree to that. And I think people didn't think Ronald Reagan was going to be that great. And lots of people didn't think these people became presidents. And not that being president of the United States is the most important thing, but take a look at other corporate leaders or other people who have done great things. They were not necessarily seen as superstars early on.
So you mentioned the presidents. In your book, you also talk about John F. Kennedy's speech that was really brought the nation together to face the challenges, et cetera. Take us back to that and tell us a little bit about what was it that was so inspiring, and how did John F. Kennedy find that voice?
Well, John F. Kennedy was elected president of the United States when he was 43, a very young age. Only Teddy Roosevelt had been president earlier, and he was, because of an assassination of McKinley, became president in 42. So John Kennedy was a new generation. He was not actually considered a gifted speaker. He had mostly been seen as a relatively poor speaker because he had a big mop of hair, and he would always look down, he didn't look up, and people just say, we just see his hair, we can't hear his voice very much. He had a very gifted speechwriter, person for whom I later worked at when I was practicing law, named Ted Sorensen, who just had a way with words that very few speechwriters do, and I think he was the greatest presidential speechwriter. He worked very hard during the transition, and the transition in those days were different. There were no offices, there were no government facilities, and there were no transition teams practically. And it was a much more modest operation. But during the transition, he worked with President Kennedy to come up with a speech, which I think inspired people. And the most famous line everybody remembers, ask not what your government can do for you, but what you can do for your government. That was the signature line. And Kennedy liked to have signature lines in his speeches, just like Churchill did. Churchill always wanted to have one or two signature lines that you would remember, and Kennedy kind of liked to follow that pattern. The speech was relatively short. It was not a long speech. And great speeches do not often turn out to be that long. Gettysburg Address was, 227 words, I think it is. So great speeches are common in that they have, if you take Martin Luther King's speech, Lincoln Gettysburg Address, and Kennedy's inaugural address, the things they have in common are they're relatively short. They rarely use the word I. They rarely say, I'm going to do something specific. They usually end with a entreaty to God. And they tend to have an uplifting message, make people feel good about themselves and about the country. And that's what Kennedy's speech did. And it inspired a lot of people like me to want to go into government service.
So, David, in your book, you actually divided, with all the people that you have interviewed, you divided them into 6 different categories of leaderships, right, like the visionaries, the builders, the transformers, et cetera. And then you pointed out that you have not been one of those. Your experience as a leader has somewhat been different, if I'm recalling correctly. If I were to ever write a book, I want to know that 7th category, that is David Rubenstein. What is it? How was it different for you, and why did you not fit into those 6 yourself?
Well, I probably wasn't any of those things. I got lucky. Luck is what I was. I wasn't a gifted finance person. I wasn't a gifted student. I probably didn't have an entrepreneurial instinct. I started a company. It took off. I got lucky. A lot of entrepreneurs get lucky. And look, most people in life who get to the top, they have a lot of luck. And I also said in the book that the most important thing in life is luck. But you make your own luck. If you sit in your room all the time and don't meet anybody, don't talk about anything with anybody, don't have any contacts, you're not likely to have the luck of somebody saying, I'm going to give you a chance, or here's an opportunity for you. So you have to make your own luck. But luck is something I got lucky with, and I had a lot of luck, for sure.
So in that book, again, I think 13 is somewhat your lucky number there, because you have 13 attributes of leadership that you talk about. Humility, for example,
right,
struck as one of them, the ability to keep learning, the integrity that you talk about. So tell us why each one of these, through examples perhaps, has been important to you.
Well, 13 is maybe an unlucky number, some people would say. We also had 13 colonies. Maybe that's a reason. But humility is an interesting concept. Every great leader is not humble. I mean, Alexander the Great attached the great to his name. That doesn't probably imply that he was humble. I don't think that Napoleon would have been classified as a humble person. And we've had a president of the United States not too long ago who nobody would say was Mr. Humility. But I do think that people admire people that are humble, and the greatest leaders I've met in business or in politics actually have a lot of humility because they realize how lucky they were. If you talk to Warren Buffett, he doesn't say, look how much money I made, look how smart I am. He doesn't do that. So a lot of people that I admire and people I think are good leaders have certain humility. And if you don't have humility, fake it. Pretend you're humble. Don't brag about how great you are. Don't be fishing for compliments and telling everybody how great you are. If people think you're great, they'll let you know, but just don't kind of go along with it. I think people admire people that way more.
So a lot of students normally, ask me, for example, how can I train myself to be a leader? And I've always felt you see a leader, when you see one, you know there is a leader. So tell us, are there some common characteristics in leaders, and can one really train oneself to be a leader?
Well, that's the age-old debate. Are you born as a leader with certain genetic material that you can't get from your parents? And, if your father and mother were great leaders, you're going to be a great leader. There's no evidence of that, honestly, because a lot of great people have children who are not that successful. And a lot of people who aren't that successful have children who are great leaders. So I suspect it's something you acquire over a period of time, and things work out a certain way. But the qualities that I put in my book were, aside from luck, you have to have some vision of where you want to go. You can't be a leader and say, I don't know where I want to take you, but just follow me. That usually doesn't work. You have to learn how to communicate with people. People follow you if they know what you want. How do you let them know what you want? You have to learn how to speak well, write well, or lead by example. That's how you communicate with people. You also have to know how to share the credit, in my view. Have some humility, I think, is important as well. Yeah, I think you also have to know how to be ethical. I think people really admire, in the end, people that are ethical. And then you have to rise to the occasion. We would never have heard of Abraham Lincoln if he'd been elected and then there was no Civil War, he would have been another person was elected and nobody would have paid much attention to him, another Whig that was elected perhaps if he had been still in the Whig Party. So I would say you have to rise to the occasion. Take Zelensky. I've met President Zelensky several times. He seemed like a nice man. He was a comedian. I didn't think he was going to be the next Churchill, but look what he's done now. He's rallied his people, and I would suspect if history comes the way he thinks it will, and I hope it will, he will be seen as a great leader because he rose to the occasion, and that's what you really need. Now, presidents that are considered a great president of the United States usually are presidents during war because you rise to the occasion. If everything works so well, nobody pays attention to you. You don't have to rise to the occasion.
So a lot of times, let's stay a little bit more on leadership because there were so many questions from our students on leadership. One of the things that our students hear often is that to be an effective business leader, you must have good IQ, and you mentioned intelligence as well, and good EQ to be having a sense of the room. But then you talk about persistence, and one of the students who asked about, and resilience, which a lot of people have qualified and called it AQ, or adversity quotient. And one of the questions submitted was there ever a time where you felt like you quit, you wanted to quit, but you still persisted and was resilient?
Well, sure. There's a difference between persistence and resilience. Mm-hmm. Persistence means you keep driving through your idea. It may not be that you've stumbled, but you just persist. Resilience means really you had some down periods of time and you came back from it. It's a little bit different. But my view is Jeff Bezos was told it's a stupid idea. I told him that too. Selling books over the internet is not going to work. Or Bill Gates, nobody thought he was going to build what he did, and the same with Steve Jobs, and the list goes on. I think you have to persist because people are always going to tell you by definition it's no good because it would have been done by somebody else. Whenever you're starting a company, you're doing something that nobody else was doing or producing some product or service nobody else is producing, and therefore somebody would say, well, if it was so good, somebody already would have done it. So you have to persist. Being resilient, and it's very important though, if you have to learn how to fail and get back on your feet, very rarely does somebody have an idea and it works perfectly from day one. You have people that tell you it's an idiotic thing. I'm sure Elon Musk was told, come on, electric cars, it's been around for a long time, it's not going to work. Or going to space in the private sector, come on, that's the government. So he would say, I don't care what you say, I just persist through it. And then when he's had some stumbles, he did in SpaceX and Tesla. Tesla almost went bankrupt at one time. SpaceX was close to that as well. You have to persist and keep going forward and overcome these mistakes. I've met some wonderful people in life who never actually accomplished that much, but they went through life not failing because they didn't want to take a risk. And if you don't take any risk, you'll never fail. But if you never fail, you'll never be ready when that real challenge comes along. So you shouldn't be afraid to fail.
So that's actually absolutely great advice there. But during COVID, a lot of people have been tested. They have been, and could you give us an example of some business leaders where you thought they did a fantastic job in demonstrating true leadership during COVID? During
COVID? Well, during COVID, I'd say maybe the best one or a very good example is the CEO of Moderna. He basically heard about the virus when he was, I think, in France at the time, or maybe on vacation, and he thought, we can do something here. He came back, he retooled his company, and he worked very hard and got some assistance from the U.S. government, and they came out with this vaccine in a record short period of time, and it turned out to be a very, very good vaccine. So I think he persisted quite nicely through and did a great job through COVID. There are other healthcare executives I think did a very good job as well. Alex Gorski at Johnson & Johnson also pulled together things and got things done. Same with the CEO of Pfizer. There's a friend of mine who passed away who has done a really good job trying to keep a company together. Arnie Sorensen, he was the CEO of Marriott. And he came down with pancreatic cancer, came back from that. But during that time, he was trying to hold together a company that was in trouble. All hotel companies and hospitality companies were in trouble because nobody was going out to hotels. And I think he did a very good job in a difficult situation. A lot of CEOs held together their companies when many people didn't think they would be able to do so.
So I was talking to a few other people, including Mayor Bowser. I asked this question, and I'm going to ask you the same question. Especially COVID has highlighted this, but often you're making decisions under uncertainty and often under pressure. So what are some of the guiding principles you use to be able to really make some difficult decisions?
Well, if you're a CEO or mayor or president, by definition, if it was easy to solve, somebody would have solved it earlier. It gets kicked up to you because other people couldn't solve it. It was more complicated than they felt they could make a decision on. Whenever you're making a decision, I've been in the Oval Office and seen this many times, you have imperfect information. You might think the President of the United States has all the information he needs to make a decision, when in fact he often feels, I don't know what this fact is, or I don't know what this person is really going to do. So generally in life, you're typically making decisions without perfect information, and you just have to get a sense of how much information you really need in order to make a decision. You'll make some wrong decisions, but you're never going to have perfect information. It never happens.
So let me go back to the American experiment for just a second. I was thinking about this. You actually mentioned that there is a relatively new gene in America, which is the realization that diversity and inclusion really bring clear strengths to the country. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I would say when this country, the human brain is an incredible device. And when you think about it, when humans came out of caves as Homo sapiens around 400,000 years ago, it wasn't evident to the elephants and the tigers and the gorillas that this species was going to conquer the earth. We weren't as fast as other animals, weren't as big, weren't as well protected against the weather. But how do we become the conquerors of the earth, for good or bad? Because of the brain. And the human brain is incredible. You could get a Shakespeare play or a Picasso painting or a Beethoven symphony out of this brain, but you also have something wrong in the brain. It basically says, if you look different than I do, I'm not going to like you as much as I like somebody who looks like me. So throughout history, people have discriminated against people that don't look like them. And clearly, I think in the white world that I'm part of, we've discriminated against people that have darker skins. And that's obviously been evident through slavery and other kinds of prejudices we've had. It is amazing how the human brain can be so wonderful in some ways and so terrible in other ways. And right now, I would say the discrimination that we've faced, that people who are not white face in our country is, I would say, typical of what actually happens around the world. It's very unusual to have two different races living together completely harmoniously, unfortunately. And we're not the only country that's had this challenge. We've had slavery, and other countries may not have had slavery, but we've had this challenge for quite some time. So I don't know that this is going to get solved anytime in the near future, because people generally like people that look like them. And when you don't look like somebody else, you get nervous that maybe something bad is going to happen to you. It's just a strange phenomenon that people don't feel like if somebody looks different than them, that they can be as compatible with their interests as somebody who looks like them.
So you mentioned in your book the American dream as one of the key genes for us, for the country.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about what that American dream means to you, and has it changed over the years?
Yes. I should have finished the other answer, though. On diversity, so when this country was created, diversity wasn't a big thing. People didn't say, well, we want to make sure everybody's included. They didn't say that. In recent years, the zeitgeist of this country has been that diversity is a plus. You'll get better decisions. You'll get smarter government decisions, smarter business decisions, if you have people of different backgrounds that reflect the population. That is not a gene that is universally shared. I don't know whether in China or India, people say, well, if you look a little different than me, or you have different views, then I want you to be included in the government. And certainly gender equality and gender diversity is something that a lot of work needs to be done. But my point was that increasingly in this country, the idea that diversity is a plus has been largely accepted, not completely. In many countries, it has not been accepted. In the American dream is a unique phenomenon. The phrase American dream was invented in 1936 by a writer. What it really reflects is the belief in this country that you can rise up from very modest circumstances by hard work and some luck and merit and get to the top. And the Horatio Alger stories that were written basically reflect that view. You work up your way up. So I believe in the American dream because I came from modest circumstances. I read about the ability of people to rise up, and that actually happens in this society. And sadly, the American dream now is believed more by people that come to this country from other countries. We have 47 million immigrants in this country, which means 47 million people came here pretty much voluntarily, and they came here because they thought life would be better, and they believed in the American dream. Many people born in this country, particularly of lower socioeconomic classes, no longer believe in the American dream. They don't think they can rise up, and as a result, you have a lot of the challenges we have in some of our urban areas.
So you mentioned a lot of people coming from outside the country here, and of course we have a lot of international students who come here who also want to be in a position to be able to have that American dream. What are their prospects, and what, as a patriot, what would your pitch be to really make them feel good about their prospects of living an American dream? And what would you caution them against?
Well, I think the United States is welcoming of people who have intellectual abilities or other skill sets to make the country better. So, for example, I think the number is something like 1/3 of the companies in Silicon Valley are run by people who are either Indian descent, or Indian American, because they have been very entrepreneurial, come over, they have very good skills and the kind of things that are useful in Silicon Valley. So I think immigrants have a greater drive. Remember, I don't know that if I was living in Europe 100 years ago, I would have said, hey, I'm going to pick up and just leave. I'm going to go to the United States, start life all over again. It might have been tough. But the people that did, they had certain drive, and when they got here, they didn't say, now my drive is gone. Now I'm going to relax. No, they had a certain drive to pick up, come to this country, start life all over again, and that drive enabled them to keep working hard when they got here. And so, I think that's an important factor, and I think immigrants have a certain higher energy level, maybe, and they also seem to know more about our country because, as you may have heard me say, it turns out that 91% of the people that take the citizenship test in this country to become citizens pass. Whereas in native-born Americans, when they take the test, most of them fail. And I think out of 49 out of 50 states, a majority of citizens recently failed the test.
So, let's continue with this. Especially, I'm focused a little bit more on our students here. You have mentioned that U.S. higher education system is the envy of the world. And you have certainly,
right.
More recently, you have been elected as the chair of the University of Chicago's Board of Trustees. And tell us a little bit about why this is important service to you, and why do you feel that the U.S. education system has been the envy of the world? What has been successful? Why have you been more successful?
Well, I would say the K-12 system is a bit of an embarrassment, and it is an interesting phenomenon that we have a K-12 system that for the average person is not so wonderful. If you're very wealthy, you may have a good access to good K-12 system. We have built the greatest higher education system in the world. The higher education system in the world that was the envy of the world in the 1800s was in Europe, Western Europe, largely England, Germany, so forth. That's passed over because the United States now has greater wealth, and we have built an incredible public education system, though with some challenges now in state legislatures cutting back on spending for public universities. But the private university system we have in our country is one where everybody around the world seems to want to get a degree from these universities. Look at the situation today. Harvard this year had 61,000 applications. 61,000. They accepted 3%. And other, select universities are same situation. People want to come to these universities because they think, A, they might get a good education, but more importantly, there's great prestige, great networking. They might make great contacts, a whole variety of different things. People are obsessed with it, and also the parents are pushing the kids to go to these schools. I sometimes talk to parents, and then I talk to the kids, and the parents call me and say, can you help my kid get into this school or that school? When I talk to the kid, I don't really care which school I go to. My parents want me to go to this school. So, it's just an interesting problem. The parents believe getting the degree from the right school or getting the right kind of education will make a difference, and generally it can be helpful. But remember, most people who are very successful in life didn't go to Harvard. Harvard has a lot of famous graduates, and Yale and Stanford do as well, Princeton, Chicago, and so forth. But most people that become successful actually didn't go to those schools, and you can rise up from any school. In fact, the greater drive might come to people who say, I didn't go to Harvard, I got to work harder.
Please feel free to use GW in that list of schools that you give examples of.
Okay.
But you have been, of course, also a leader in what you term as patriotic philanthropy. You have been involved with transformative gifts for a lot of things in DC itself, around the country. What motivates you about those?
Well, when you make a fair amount of money, you can say, and I have a fair amount of money by normal standards, not by Bill Gates standards, but for a fair amount of money, you can say, okay, what are you going to do with it? You can build a pyramid and put all your wealth in it. When you die, it's all there, but that usually is not a good idea. Worked for the pharaohs, but not probably a good idea. So what are you going to do with it? You can give your money to your children and spoil them and ruin them. That's not a great idea. I'm not sure the children agree with that, but generally I think giving your children $1 billion a piece is probably not a great idea. So then you basically say, all right, I'm going to give it away to some good cause, and I'll wait till I die because I don't know how much money I'll need before I die. But generally, you don't need as much money as you die with. So my view was I wanted to give it away while I'm alive. And so I was an original signer of the Giving Pledge. But most people that give away money tend to give it away to educational and medical research. And actually, that is the bulk of what my gifts are. They're for universities or K-12 education or medical research. Or cultural events, the Kennedy Center, Smithsonian, and so forth. But I have given about 5% of my money, though it's 95% of the attention that it gets, to things that remind people the history and heritage of our country. So buy the Magna Carta, buy the Declaration of Independence, put it on display so people could see it, fix the Washington Monument, fix Lincoln Memorial. And the theory is that if you see the historic document in person, you might be more educated about American history, and therefore that be a better citizen. And if we have things like the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and people want to go visit them because they're in good shape, they might learn more about American history. And the theory is if you learn more about American history, you might be able to avoid the mistakes of the past and be a more educated citizenry. That's the reason why I do it.
So which one of these transformative gifts has been really the most meaningful for you?
Well, it's like asking which of my children I like the most. I like them all. But I've been surprised that, sometimes how things get attention. So Bill Gates gives $1 billion to malaria, which he's done. It gets, one line in the paper because he's expected he does that. If I put up $10 million to fix the Washington Monument, which is a drop in the bucket compared to what Bill Gates has done, it gets enormous amount of attention, maybe because people didn't think a private citizen should fix the Washington Monument. Or if I bagged the Magna Carta for, a fair amount of money, but not $1 billion, it gets a lot of attention because people just didn't expect it. So, I think the things that have gotten the most attention probably are buying the Magna Carta, maybe fixing the Washington Monument. But I think I've done a bit more significant than that, but that's what's getting the most attention.
Right. So in the last interview, you talked about some of the literacy efforts, and you said, students and children should really be concentrating on reading and appreciating books.
Right.
So especially from the perspectives of finance right now, should they be just waiting for your investments book, or are there some other books that you might recommend?
There are a lot of great books on investing, but to be a great investor, you can't read a book. Like if you could be a great golfer by reading a book about Tiger Woods, everybody would read that book. But we know that reading a book won't make you necessarily great, but it can give you ideas, can inspire you. And so the reason I think books are important is that reading an email or a tweet, it doesn't take that much brain power to do that. They're relatively short. To read a book, you have to be focused for a while. And I think one of the things that I think is very good is getting people to focus their brain. Having the ability to read a book shows your ability to focus and learn something. I think you get more out of books than you do out of tweets or memos. And that's why I say people should read. And I like to point out to people that 14% of the adults in this country are functionally illiterate, which means they can't read past the 4th grade level. And I don't mean they came from another country and they can't read English, but they can read their own language. That's not the case. I mean 14% can't read any language being past the 4th grade level. You can't read past the 4th grade level, your chance of success in this country is very, very limited. So I encourage people to read. You can't read too much. And I like to remind people when I give a commencement address, the word commencement means beginning. It doesn't mean end. 50-some% of college graduates never read another book in their life after they graduate from college, which means that they may read other stuff, but they don't read another book. And it's a sad situation. I think one of the great pleasures of my life is reading books, and so it's a great thrill. But I'm sad that so many people don't do it.
Yeah. So in the time remaining, and I know I want to respect your time, but I do want to have 2 more questions, and they come from students. One of them is a 21-year-old student asking you about what advice would you give your 21-year-old self now that you have so much experience and wisdom?
Well, when I was 21 years old, different world. But today, if I was 21, I would say experiment. I told my own children, I have 3 children. Now, maybe I did a bad job with them. They're all in private equity, what I've called mankind's highest calling. But they all have MBAs, they're all in private equity. So it's either good or bad. I'm not sure, depending on your point of view. But I tell people, and my own children, experiment. You're not likely to find the thing that you're going to do with your life at the age of 21. Obviously, Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg are exceptions. But the norm is try different things. Find something that you ultimately love so that working there is not painful or a job, it's pleasurable. And then try to make more contacts than your normal comfortable self might want you to do. You can't make too many contacts. You can't know too many people. You never know where a good idea or opportunity might come along. And also try to figure out how to give back to society in an important way. I've been trying to do it later in life, but I wish I had done more of this when I was in my 20s or 30s, and I'd have more experience then.
So that's great advice, David. One of the other questions that students have asked, they have watched many of your interviews, they have seen how you've conducted yourself as a businessman and as a philanthropist, and they are wondering, with all your background, have you considered some political office, or would you consider some political office for more impact? Like, do we have President Rubenstein in the making here?
I'm too young. I'm only 72 years old. You need to be 79, 70, 80 to kind of run for a serious office. No, because today people are willing to listen to me, and you're willing to interview me and have me here because I haven't been running for office. If I run for office, everything I ever did from the 6th grade on would come out, and I'm afraid that people would say, well, look, I knew him in the 6th grade, and he played spin the bottle too aggressively, and I just think he's not a good person. But I'm very comfortable with where I am now, and I'm trying to give back to society. I think probably the next generation of political leaders in this country should be younger than I am. So people do ask me this all the time, and I'm shocked because I think the country is going to elect a private equity person into a senior position. On the other hand, somebody I hired 25 years ago, he told me he was going to leave and get into politics. I said, Glenn, you have no chance of getting elected governor of Virginia. I have a lot of experience in knowing about politics, and then he got elected governor of Virginia, so what do I know?
Well, thank you, David, for a wonderful, thank you for spending an hour with us.
My pleasure.
I really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us today, both in person.
Thanks a lot.
Indeed. And I'll invite you to, of course, join us for our next season in George Talks Business, because this was the season finale. Please stay tuned for the next speaker announcement, which is coming soon. So thank you again for joining us today. And for all of you who are present here, there is some pizza upstairs in the Champions Club in the upper level, so please feel free to join there. Thank you again.
Thank you.